The moment Reverend Calloway opened his mouth to declare Gerald Hoffstead and Miriam Colby husband and wife, a shadow filled the doorway of the little church, broad as a barn beam, tall enough to block the afternoon sun, and a voice like rolling thunder said, I want the big one." Every head in the congregation of Dusty Creek, Colorado turned at once. The women gasped. The men reached instinctively for guns they had set aside for the occasion, and Miriam Colby, standing at the altar in her ivory dress with her veil crooked and her cheeks already flushed from an hour of whispered cruelties from Gerald's mother, felt the blood drain from her face so completely that the red roses embroidered on her bodice seemed to be the only color left in her entire body. The man in the doorway was unlike anything the town of Dusty Creek had ever witnessed walk through its borders. He stood at least 6'4", possibly taller, with shoulders that seemed almost too wide for the frame of the church entrance. His hair was dark brown and fell past his jaw in loose waves, tangled from the trail and caught with dust from the mountain pass. A beard, full but not unkempt, covered the lower half of a face that was hard-boned and weathered by years of living above the tree line. His arms, bare below the rolled sleeves of a buckskin shirt, were corded with muscle in a way that suggested not vanity, but sheer practical use, the kind of body built by felling trees and carrying elk carcasses and surviving winters that would kill most men. His hands were enormous. One of them was wrapped around the wooden doorframe. The other was pointing. He was pointing directly at Miriam Colby. Gerald Hoffstead, who stood at the altar in a pressed suit that cost more than most of the congregation earned in a month, had gone the color of curdled milk. He was a slight man, lean in the way that comes from calculation rather than labor, with pale eyes that had always reminded Miriam of a fish. He had a tendency to look past people when he spoke to them, as though searching for someone more interesting, and he had spent the better part of the last year making Miriam feel that her considerable size — she was full-figured and round-hipped, with soft arms and a generous bosom, and a face that her mother had always called lovely — was some kind of ongoing personal failure of his. "I beg your pardon," Gerald said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. The mountain man did not look at Gerald. He kept his eyes fixed on Miriam with an intensity that was not threatening, but was so direct and so certain that Miriam felt something inside her chest shift, like a riverstone turning over after a flood. "You," the mountain man said, and his voice was quieter now but no less certain. "The big one. I want to speak to a priest, right now, before this goes any further." The Reverend, who was a small and bespectacled man named Calloway, who had been performing weddings in Dusty Creek for 23 years and had never once encountered an interruption of this nature, pressed both hands flat on his pulpit and stared over his spectacles. This is highly irregular," he managed. "Yes, it is," the mountain man agreed, stepping inside. The floorboards groaned beneath him. "But so is marrying a woman who doesn't want to be married." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Miriam could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear Gerald's mother, a compact and vicious woman named Dorothea, sucking air through her nose. She could hear the creak of the church settling in the afternoon heat. She could also hear, somewhere beneath all of that, a voice inside her own head that had been trying to speak for months, and it was saying, "He is not wrong." Miriam had known Gerald Hoffstead for 2 years. She had been introduced to him at a church social by her father, who owned a modest dry goods store on the main street of Dusty Creek and who had made no secret of his anxiety about his eldest daughter's prospects. Miriam was 24. In 1874, in a Colorado mountain town, 24 and unmarried was beginning to attract the kind of quiet concern that preceded outright pity. Her younger sister Clara had married at 19 and already had 2 children. Her mother asked about Gerald every Sunday without fail, and Gerald, to his credit, had been perfectly attentive during their courtship, had brought flowers and sat on the porch and made reasonable conversation, right up until the moment the engagement was announced, after which point he had begun, slowly and systematically, to make Miriam feel small. It had started with comments. Gerald's family was wealthier than hers, and he had a habit of noting the things she wore, the foods she ate, the softness of her figure, in ways that were never quite insults, but were never quite not insults either. He had suggested twice that she might benefit from eating less bread. He had looked away when she laughed too loudly. He had introduced her to his business associates as my Miriam, with the particular inflection of a man describing something he had settled for. His mother had been worse, openly worse, with no pretense at subtlety, calling Miriam substantial and hearty, with a bright, cheerful cruelty that the other women in Gerald's social circle seemed to find merely humorous. By the morning of the wedding, Miriam had been in the dressing room at the back of the church for 3 hours, while Dorothea Hoffstead and 2 of Gerald's aunts had pulled at her dress and clucked about her waist and made suggestions about what she might do differently. Once she was properly a Hoffstead, and the word that sat at the center of all of it, never spoken but always present, was fat. They thought she was fat, and they wanted her to know it, and they wanted her to be grateful anyway for the privilege of marrying into a family that would condescend to take her. She had told herself she could survive it. She had stood at that altar and gripped her wildflower bouquet and told herself that this was just how marriage was, that love was something that came later, that her mother and father had managed, and she would too. And then the shadow had appeared in the doorway. The mountain man walked down the center aisle of the church with the unhurried certainty of a man who was fully comfortable taking up space, and the congregation parted for him the way water parted for a boulder. He stopped about 6 feet from the altar and looked at Reverend Calloway. "I need you to hear something," he said, "and then I need you to decide if you can, in good conscience, continue." "Now see here," Gerald started, stepping forward. The mountain man looked at him, just looked. Gerald stopped. "My name is Emmett Hale," the man said, addressing the Reverend now, his voice carrying easily through the packed church. "I've been trapping and hunting in the mountains north of here for the past 4 years. I came down to Dusty Creek 3 days ago for supplies. I had supper at the boarding house." He paused. "I heard things." A nervous rustling went through the congregation. "What kind of things?" Reverend Calloway asked cautiously. "I heard this man," Emmett Hale said without looking at Gerald, "tell the barkeep at Sullivan's that he was marrying the Colby girl because her father owed him money, and this was how he was collecting the debt." The sound that followed was not a gasp. It was something more complex. A collective intake of breath followed immediately by the particular silence of people who were not entirely surprised, but had not expected to hear it said aloud. Miriam went very still. Her father, seated in the front pew, had his face in his hands. "That is a slanderous and outrageous lie," Gerald said, but his voice had taken on a thin, reedy quality that did not suggest righteous indignation so much as a man calculating his options. "Sullivan heard it," Emmett said simply, "and Sullivan told his wife. And Sullivan's wife told half the women in this town. You might want to ask your reverend if that's how a man ought to enter into a sacrament." Reverend Calloway had removed his spectacles and was pressing them against his chest as though seeking divine guidance. He looked at Gerald. He looked at Miriam. He looked at the man standing in his church like a mountain that had grown feet and walked inside. "Mr. Hoffstead," he said quietly, "is there any truth to what this man is saying?" "Of course there isn't," Dorothea Hoffstead said sharply from the front pew, rising to her feet. She was dressed all in blue and looked like a furious bird. "This man is a vagrant and a troublemaker, and I want him removed immediately." "Mrs. Hoffstead," the Reverend said with surprising firmness, "I did not ask you." The silence stretched. Gerald's pale eyes moved around the room in that sliding way they had, looking for an exit, finding none. Miriam watched him and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, like stepping into cold water, that she had known this for a long time. She had known it and chosen not to know it, because knowing it would have required her to do something about it, and she hadn't had the courage. "Father," she said. Her father looked up from his hands. His eyes were red. He was a small, tired man named Thomas Colby, who had come to Colorado from Ohio 20 years ago, with more hope than money, and had spent the intervening decades watching the gap between those two things remain stubbornly consistent. "Father," she said again, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "Do you owe Gerald Hoffstead money?" Thomas Colby closed his eyes. "Father." "Miriam, do you?" A long silence, then, "Yes." The word hit the church like a stone hitting water, sending ripples outward through every pew. "How much?" she asked. $400, he said, barely audible. "Since the spring." $400. It was an enormous sum. It was the kind of sum that could ruin a man like Thomas Colby. And Gerald Hoffstead had known that, and had leveraged it, and had dressed it up as courtship and wrapped it in flowers and Sunday afternoon conversation, and had never once looked at Miriam Colby as anything other than a transaction. Miriam set down her wildflower bouquet on the altar. She did it carefully, as though it were something fragile. Then she turned to face Gerald Hoffstead, and something in her expression made him take a small step backward. "Gerald," she said quietly. "Miriam, let me explain." "I don't want an explanation," she said. "I want you to tell me honestly, right now, in front of God and everyone in this church, whether you ever once thought of me as a person." He opened his mouth. He closed it. His pale eyes moved away from her face. That was her answer. She reached up and unpinned her veil, took it off, and held it for a moment before placing it beside the bouquet. Then she turned to Reverend Calloway. "I believe," she said, with a composure that she would later tell people felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, "that this wedding is over." Reverend Calloway nodded. He actually looked relieved. What happened next was not dignified. Dorothea Hoffstead began to speak, loudly, about Miriam's character and figure and social standing, and several of the women in the congregation began to respond, and Gerald attempted to take Miriam by the arm, and then a very large hand appeared on Gerald's shoulder. "I'd step back," Emmett Hale said pleasantly. Gerald stepped back. Emmett looked down at Miriam. He was close enough now that she could see the green of his eyes, a deep forest green shot through with brown, and the way the afternoon light caught the dust in his dark hair. Up close, he was even more extraordinary. Not handsome in the conventional way that the illustrated papers described handsome men, but compelling in a way that was entirely physical and entirely present, as though his body occupied space with more intention than most. "Miss Colby," he said, and his voice had dropped to something that was just for her. "Would you like to leave?" She looked up at him. He was so much taller than she was that the angle made her feel oddly safe, like looking up at a canyon wall. His expression was serious and very direct, but there was something in it that was also careful, as though he understood that he had just blown her entire life sideways and was prepared to treat that with the gravity it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I believe I would." He offered his arm. She took it. They walked out of the church together while Dusty Creek watched with its collective mouth open, and the afternoon sun hit them both on the steps, bright and hot and wide open. Miriam stood on the top step of the church and breathed the outside air and tried to understand what had just happened to her. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry I couldn't do it differently," he said. "I thought about going to your father first, but I wasn't sure there was time." "There wasn't," she said. She looked down at her hands, still holding the shape of the bouquet they no longer contained. "How did you know that I didn't want to be there?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the main street of Dusty Creek, which was doing its Sunday afternoon business in the golden September heat. "I've spent a lot of years watching animals that are caught in something they can't get out of," he said. "They get a particular look. You had it when I looked through the window." She turned to look at him. "You looked through the window?" "I wasn't sure what I was going to do," he said, with what she thought might have been the faint beginning of embarrassment. "I wanted to see first." For reasons she could not entirely explain, Miriam Colby laughed. It came out of her without warning, genuine and full, and not at all like the careful, controlled sounds she had been making around Gerald and his family for 2 years. It was her real laugh, the one Clara always said sounded like she was falling downstairs, and she had not heard it in so long that it almost startled her. Emmett Hale watched her laugh. Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a door opening just a crack. The next hour was among the most uncomfortable of Miriam's life, and also among the most clarifying. Her mother came out of the church in tears, not on Miriam's behalf, but about the general situation, expressing concern about the family's reputation and what people would say. Her father followed, looking destroyed in the quiet way of a man who had been living with shame for long enough that its public appearance was almost a relief. Dorothea Hoffstead swept past them all with a face that could have curdled milk and made a comment, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, about what happened when a woman above her station made decisions she wasn't equipped to make. Emmett was still standing near Miriam when Dorothea said it. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and the sheer physical fact of him seemed to render most of Dorothea's cruelty somewhat weightless, like throwing stones at a mountainside. "Miriam," her father said, standing in front of her with his hat in his hands, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have told you." "Why didn't you?" she asked. She wasn't angry, exactly. She was something more complicated, hurt and sad, and also, increasingly, freed. "Because you seemed happy enough," he said. "And I thought maybe it would work out. I thought if you were settled and the debt would be forgiven," she finished quietly. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Yes." She put her hand on his arm. "We'll figure out the money, Father, somehow. But you cannot ever do something like that again." He nodded miserably. She turned back to find Emmett Hale had given them a respectful distance and was standing a few yards away, looking out at the street with the patient, still quality of a man very accustomed to waiting. He had a battered hat in his hands and was turning it in a slow circle, and Miriam noticed that despite the enormity of what he had just done, walking into a church and stopping a wedding in front of the entire town, he did not appear remotely troubled by it. She walked over to him. "Mr. Hale," he turned. "Ma'am." "What happens now?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "That's entirely up to you, Miss Colby." "Where are you staying?" "At the boarding house, Mrs. Fletcher's place." "Are you going back to the mountains?" "I was planning to," he said. "I came down for the winter supplies run. Another week or two, then back up before the first snow." She nodded slowly. "You walked into a church and stopped my wedding," she said, "on the basis of something you heard at a bar." "Yes. That's either very brave or very foolish." "Most of the things worth doing are one or the other," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He let her look. He seemed entirely unbothered by scrutiny, which she found remarkable in a man. "Would you like to have supper with my family tonight?" she asked. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but something quiet and warm. "I'd be honored," he said. The Colby household that Sunday evening was a study in domestic chaos barely contained by good manners and the presence of a stranger. Her mother, Ruth Colby, had redirected her crisis of nerves into cooking, which was her reliable solution to all of life's catastrophes, and the kitchen smelled of roasting chicken and fresh bread. Clara had arrived with her husband Ben and their 2 small children, and she kept looking at Emmett Hale across the table with the expression of someone trying to solve an arithmetic problem that kept coming out differently every time. Clara was 22 and resembled Miriam in the broad strokes, dark hair, dark eyes, a wide smile, but was smaller and quicker in the way of people who are always in motion. She had always been Miriam's closest friend, as well as her sister, and Miriam could see her formulating questions with every bite she took. Thomas Colby had recovered some of his color and was doing the thing he was genuinely good at, which was drawing men out in conversation. He asked Emmett about the mountains, and Emmett talked about them with a plain-spoken directness that was clearly not performance. He had been living in the Rockies since he was 22, he said. He was 28 now. He had grown up in Missouri, had come west with a trapping outfit after his father died, had ended up staying when the outfit dissolved, and everyone else went home or further west. He had a cabin above 9,000 feet on a stretch of the mountain that didn't belong to anyone officially. "Don't you get lonely?" Ruth asked before she could stop herself, and then looked slightly mortified. Emmett considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he said. "But loneliness in the mountains is different from loneliness in town. In town, there are people all around you and you still feel it. In the mountains, it's just the land, and it's honest." Miriam watched him say this and felt something resonate in her chest like a struck bell. After supper, Clara maneuvered Miriam into the kitchen on the pretext of washing dishes. "Miriam Elizabeth Colby," she said the moment the door was closed. "Don't," Miriam said. "He walked into your wedding?" "I know." "And stopped it?" "I was there, Clara." "Because he thought you didn't want to be there." Clara set down the dish she was holding. "Did you?" Not want to be there? Miriam was quiet for a moment, looking at the kitchen window and the dark beyond it. I wanted to want to be there, she said finally. I thought if I got through the ceremony, the feeling would come. And instead, a mountain man appeared in the doorway. Stop making it sound like a dime novel. Miriam, it is a dime novel. Look at him. Clara gestured toward the parlor with an enthusiastic lack of subtlety. He is enormous, and he has the jawline, Miriam. Clara, I'm just saying, and he clearly… She paused. He looked at you the whole time, at supper. When he thought no one was watching him, he was watching you. Miriam felt warmth rise to her face. He feels responsible, she said. He's a decent man. He doesn't want to think he left me stranded. Maybe, Clara said. Or maybe he's been alone on a mountain for 6 years and he walked into town and saw you and decided to do something about it. That is absolutely not. Is it so impossible, Clara said gently now, leaning against the counter with her arms folded, that someone might look at you and want you? You, exactly as you are? Miriam didn't answer immediately. The honest answer was yes. She had come to believe it was a little bit impossible, and that belief had crept into her so gradually over the past 2 years that she hadn't noticed when it had become her default assumption. I don't know him, she said. You have a week, Clara said. He's here for a week. Get to know him. Emmett Hale spent the following 2 days going about the business he had come to town for. He visited the general store for flour, salt, dried beans, and several pounds of hard tack, arranged for rifle ammunition at the gun shop, and had a long conversation with the blacksmith about a trap mechanism he wanted repaired. Dusty Creek watched him do all of this with considerable interest, the way a small town watched anything new, and opinion was sharply divided on the matter of what he had done at the church. The men who drank at Sullivan's were largely in favor of him. Ben Fletcher, who ran the livery, said he had more nerve than sense, but that sense wasn't always the most important thing. The older women of the town were divided. Several of them thought it was the most romantic thing they had ever witnessed, and said so with enthusiasm, while others felt it was an outrageous intrusion and said so with equal enthusiasm. Gerald Hoffstead had departed for his family's ranch east of town with his mother and his wounded dignity, which most people felt was the best possible outcome. Miriam spent those 2 days in a state of suspended feeling, as though the world had rearranged itself into a new configuration, and she had not yet learned the geography. She went to her father's store and helped with the accounts. She visited Clara. She sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the sun go down behind the mountains to the west, those tremendous dark shapes against the orange sky, and tried to understand what she wanted. On the 3rd morning after the wedding that wasn't, she was at the general store buying thread when Emmett Hale came in for lamp oil. He saw her at the counter and stopped, and there was a brief moment of the particular social awkwardness that follows unexpected disruptions of enormous events. Good morning, Miss Colby, he said. Good morning, Mr. Hale, she said. The proprietor, a man named Abner Steele, who was constitutionally incapable of tolerating silence, said, You two know each other then, with tremendous obviousness, and went back to his inventory. Emmett moved to stand beside her at the counter. He was wearing a cleaner version of his buckskin shirt and had clearly made some effort with his hair, which was combed back from his face and only moderately disobedient. He smelled of pine resin and something warm that she couldn't identify. How are you getting on? He asked quietly. People keep looking at me, she said. I imagine they do. Clara says it's romantic. My mother says it's scandalous. The Reverend came by yesterday and said he thought it was divinely guided. She paused. I'm not sure what I think. What do you feel? He asked. It was a straightforward question, asked without art or contrivance. She looked up at him. Relieved, she said honestly, frightened, embarrassed, also something else that I don't have a word for yet. He nodded slowly, as though this were a reasonable and complete answer. Would you walk with me? She asked. This evening, along the river road. Yes, he said. No hesitation. The river road ran south from the main street of Dusty Creek along the banks of Dusty Creek itself, which was neither particularly dusty nor particularly creaky, but was a pleasant, clear-running mountain stream that widened into something almost respectable about a mile out of town. The cottonwoods along its banks had gone gold with the early September turning, and the air in the late afternoon carried the particular clean sharpness of altitude. They walked for a while without talking, which Miriam noticed was comfortable in a way she had not expected. Most silences with Gerald had felt loaded, like unexploded things. This silence was simply quiet. "Tell me about your cabin," she said eventually. He was quiet for a moment, and she could tell from his expression that this was something he thought about carefully rather than quickly. "It's not large," he said. "One main room and a sleeping loft. I built it 3 years ago from timber I cut on the ridge above it. The roof is solid and the chimney draws well, and in winter, when there's 3 feet of snow on the ground and nothing moving in any direction, it's the warmest place I've ever been." "That sounds like something," she said. "It does sound like something," he agreed. "Do you want to stay there? For the rest of your life?" He considered that too. "I want to be in the mountains," he said. "Whether I stay in that particular cabin, I don't know. That depends on things I don't know yet." She looked at the creek for a while. A heron was standing in the shallows, absolutely motionless, the way herons are. "I've never left Colorado," she said. "I've never been more than 30 miles from Dusty Creek in any direction. Does that bother you?" "It used to seem like it should bother me and didn't," she said. "Now I'm not sure. I think maybe what I wanted to leave was not the place, but the shape of the life I was being asked to fit into." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes." "When I looked through that window and saw you at the altar," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man choosing each word deliberately. "You were looking straight ahead at the Reverend, and your hands were very still, and your face was absolutely composed. And I thought, that woman is somewhere else entirely. She has left the building and left her body there as a replacement." He paused. "I've seen that look in the mountains on animals that have decided to stop fighting. I couldn't walk past it." Miriam felt the backs of her eyes sting in a way she absolutely was not going to acknowledge in public. "Why did you say what you said?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "The way you said it. Why did you point at me and say what you said?" He looked for the first time slightly rueful. "I was going to say it differently," he said. "I was going to say something reasonable and measured. But when I got to the door and saw the whole room and you there at the altar, it just came out." "I want the big one," she quoted at him. Her voice was perfectly flat. He had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "That came out wrong. You pointed at me in front of the whole congregation." "I know. In front of Gerald's mother, who has been telling me for 6 months that I ought to eat less bread." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, which promptly fell back into its habitual disorder. "I was not trying to describe I meant that you were the most significant thing in the room, the one with the most, the one who—" He stopped. "I'm better in the mountains than in churches," he said. She looked at him. He was genuinely mortified, which was somehow endearing in a man of his size, a quality she had not anticipated. "I know what you meant," she said, and she did, and the knowledge of it sat quietly warm in the center of her chest. It was still mortifying. "I know," he said again. "I'm sorry." "You are also forgiven," she said, "given the circumstances." He looked relieved in a way that was also somehow large, like everything about him. They walked back as the sun dropped behind the mountains, and the sky turned the particular deep violet of Colorado September evenings. The first stars were appearing by the time they reached the edge of town, and the lights in the windows of the boarding house and the store and the church were coming on one by one. "I leave in 4 days," he said. "I know. I'd like to see you again, before I go." She turned to look at him. He was looking down at her with that direct, serious gaze that she was beginning to find oddly steadying rather than intimidating. She thought about what Clara had said. She thought about the heron in the creek, motionless and certain in the shallows. "Tomorrow," she said. "Come to supper again." He came to supper the next evening, and the one after that, and by the third evening her mother had stopped making nervous conversation and simply set his place at the table as though it had always been there. Thomas Colby, in the way of men who feel they owe something and want to discharge the debt through action, had been talking with Emmett about trapping roots and the price of beaver pelts in the state of the mountain passes in autumn, and these conversations seemed to do something good for both of them. Her father had been a different shade of himself since Sunday, lighter somehow, as though the weight of the secret he had been carrying had changed the color he reflected, and its absence was allowing him to be more himself again. On Emmett's last evening in Dusty Creek, Miriam walked with him to the edge of town where the road began its long curve north toward the mountains. The night air was cold now, properly cold in the way of Colorado at altitude in September, with a bite to it that promised snow within weeks. They stood at the fork in the road in the light of a half-moon, and Miriam looked up at the mountains, which were black silhouettes against a sky full of more stars than she ever managed to see properly from town. "I want to write to you," he said. She looked at him. "You write letters?" "I do. My mother insisted on education." Something that might have been humor crossed his face. "I'm better with words on paper than I am out of my mouth in churches." "I will hold you to that standard," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face, which had come loose from its pin in the wind. His hand was enormous, and his touch was extraordinarily gentle, and she felt it through her entire body. "I'll be back in the spring," he said, "when the pass opens up." "Spring," she said. "That's 7 months." "Yes, that's a long time." "I know." His hand had not moved from near her face. "But all right." "You had better," she said. He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen on him, unhidden and full, and it transformed his whole face in the way that certain landscapes transform in the moment the sun comes out from behind a cloud. She felt it like a physical force. "Miriam," he said, and just the sound of her name in that voice, quiet and certain and meant entirely for her, was something she thought she might keep turning over in her memory for a very long time. "When I come back in the spring, I'm not going to pretend I'm coming back just to restock my supplies." "Good," she said. "I would be insulted if you were." He laughed. She heard it for the first time properly, and it was a good laugh, low and genuine, and she had the strong impression of a man who did not laugh casually. He did not kiss her. She understood that this was deliberate, a line he was drawing carefully. He had already turned her life sideways once, and he was not going to take more than she was offering. She respected it enormously and was also privately somewhat frustrated by it. "Good night, Mr. Hale," she said. "Good night, Miss Colby," he said. He walked north into the dark with the sure, unhurried stride of a man who knows where he is going, and Miriam stood at the fork and watched him until the dark had taken him, and then stood there a while longer. The first letter arrived in late October. It was written in a hand that was surprisingly fine, clear and deliberate, with none of the shakiness of hands more accustomed to tools than pens, on paper that had been folded 3 times and sealed with wax that was slightly lopsided. The letter described the first snowfall of the season, which had come on a Tuesday night and covered everything by morning. It described the mountains in winter in the way that painters attempted to describe things they loved, looking for the exact word for each specific quality of light and cold. It was a letter that did not attempt to be a love letter, and was, in that restraint, more moving than any love letter Miriam had ever read or imagined. She wrote back the same evening. Her letter described Dusty Creek in autumn, the way the cottonwoods had finally gone fully gold, and then were stripped bare in a single high wind night that left them standing like clean bones against the sky. She described her father's store and the particular mathematics of dry goods inventory in the approach to winter. She described Clara's youngest, who had just begun to walk and treated every horizontal surface as a personal affront. She wrote for 6 pages and did not once say the thing that was perhaps most present in every line of all of them, because it seemed too soon and too large and too much like something you should not commit to paper until you were certain it would be received. She was certain it would be received. She was terrified of it anyway. The letters came regularly through October and into November, finding her by whatever postal arrangement existed between Dusty Creek and the nearest mountain post stop, carried by whoever was coming down from the higher elevations before the serious winter settled in. Emmett wrote about the elk that had been using the meadow below his cabin. He wrote about a wolverine that had been raiding his traps and his philosophical admiration for its stubbornness, which he respected, even while he worked to outsmart it. He wrote about the nights when the cold was so absolute that the stars looked cut rather than simply seen, and about what it felt like to be the only human creature in 3 square miles of wilderness, and find it, somehow, enough. She wrote about small things, and underneath the small things, larger ones. She wrote about what she'd been thinking about the wedding, now that she had enough distance from it to think about it properly. She wrote that she had come to understand she had been trying for 2 years to fold herself into a smaller shape, and that she was not sure she wanted to do that with anyone ever again. She wrote that she was aware this was a strange thing to say in a letter to a man she had known for less than 2 weeks total, and that she was also finding it considerably easier to say in a letter than in person, and that she hoped he would not hold either of those facts against her. His response to that letter came 3 weeks later, written on pages that showed the marks of being carried a long way in a pocket, and it said that he had spent 4 years in the mountains discovering that the things worth doing were always the things that required you to be exactly the size you actually were, and that anything that required you to be smaller was not worth doing at all, and that he intended to hold nothing against her except her attention, which he was finding increasingly necessary and entirely remarkable. Miriam read that letter 4 times, then she folded it and placed it in the box she kept under her bed with the other ones. December was cold and quiet, and Christmas passed in the Colby household with a warmth that the season had been lacking the previous year, when Gerald's presence had put a particular tension into every gathering. Thomas Colby had been quietly negotiating his debt to the Hoffstead family, and the matter had been settled. Gerald, perhaps conscious of the town's opinion of him, had agreed to a repayment arrangement that, while strict, was manageable. Dorothea Hoffstead had been heard to say several things about the Colby family at the women's sewing circle that had caused 2 of its members to decline to attend until she apologized, which she had eventually done with a gracefulness that suggested she found it physically painful. The letters from Emmett slowed through December and January when the snow made travel to the post stop impossible, but did not stop entirely. She received one in mid-January that must have been carried down by a hunter or trapper coming through, written by firelight on paper stained with wood smoke, which described a blizzard that had lasted 4 days and kept him entirely inside, during which time he had read the 3 books he kept on his shelf and then started rereading them, and found himself making notes in the margins about what he would tell her when he could write again. The notes, he said, had run to 6 additional pages. He was editing them for relevance and dignity. She laughed out loud reading that, alone in her room, in a way that she was fairly certain her mother would have described as undignified. February brought longer days, and Miriam spent them doing something she had not done with any seriousness since she was young. She began drawing again. She had always had a facility for it, a good eye and a steady hand, but it had been discouraged by Gerald in the mild, persistent way he discouraged things, and she had let it go. Now she drew the mountains from her porch, the long, white ridgeline against winter sky, the particular shapes of the peaks she had looked at her whole life, and also the town and the creek and Clara's children and the face she kept seeing when she thought about spring. The face was difficult to get right. She filled several pages trying. In March, the first signs of the mountain thaw began, and the letters came more frequently. His tone had changed over the winter months, a quality of held-back feeling appearing beneath the careful observational prose, and she recognized it because she was aware of the same quality in her own letters. They were both, she thought, people who moved carefully in matters of the heart, she from having had her heart so carefully reduced, he from having had so little occasion to offer it. He wrote in March, "I have been trying to determine when exactly it became the case that writing to you was the activity around which I organized the rest of my days. I have not been successful in identifying the precise moment which suggests it happened the way certain things in the mountains happen, gradually and then all at once, without announcement." She read that sentence standing at the kitchen window on a Thursday morning in early March and held the paper against her chest for a moment before she could read the rest. She wrote back, "I know exactly what you mean." April came and the passes began to open, and in mid-April she received a letter that said only, "I'm coming down in 3 weeks. I'll be there by the first week of May if the snow holds off. I've been thinking about what I want to say to you when I see you, and I've decided that some of it should not be said in a letter." She put that letter in the box with the others. Then she went to Clara's house and sat in her kitchen, while the children ran around them and told Clara everything, all at once, in a rush. And Clara listened with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup and the expression of a woman who is extremely gratified to have been right about something. "Well," Clara said when Miriam stopped talking, "it seems to me there are some things you should say back to him that also should not be said in a letter." "I know," Miriam said. "You're going to let yourself have this," Clara said. It was not a question, but it had the quality of a question. Miriam thought about the altar and the bouquet she had set down so carefully. She thought about the shape of herself she had been trying to compress for 2 years and the relief of stopping. She thought about herons in creek water and wolverines and 4-day blizzards and 6 pages of margin notes being edited for dignity. "Yes," she said, "I am." He arrived on the 4th day of May, 1875, in the early afternoon, coming up the main street of Dusty Creek on a bay horse loaded with winter furs and equipment, looking exactly as he had looked in September, except that he was perhaps slightly leaner from the winter, and his hair had grown another inch, and he had an air of contained purpose that was immediately obvious to anyone paying attention. Miriam was at her father's store when she heard the particular quality of silence that meant something had arrived in the street to be looked at. She came to the door and saw him, and he was already looking at the store as though he knew she was there. He dismounted and handed the horse to the boy who swept out the livery, and he came across the street, and she came down the 2 steps of the store porch, and they stood in front of each other in the May afternoon sun. He was larger than she remembered, or perhaps it was simply that memory had not quite managed to account for the total presence of him, the breadth and height and quiet, solid certainty of him. "You're here," she said. "I told you I'd come in spring," he said. "You did." She looked up at him. "How are the passes?" "Clear enough," he said. "I came fast." "Because of the supplies?" "No," he said. He was looking at her with the same direct, unhurried attention he had been looking at her with since September, and it struck her that this was perhaps the most remarkable thing about him, the completeness of his attention, how fully and freely it was given, how different it was from being looked past. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and she felt the warmth and roughness of them and the gentle sureness of how they held her. "Come inside," she said. "My father will want to see you." "In a moment," he said, and with his free hand he reached into the front pocket of his shirt and took out a folded piece of paper which was somewhat battered and had clearly been carried a very long way. He held it out to her. She unfolded it. It was covered in dense writing, and she could see immediately that it was one of those letters he had described, the margin note letters, the ones about what he wanted to tell her when he could write again. It was the longest thing he had ever written her, running both sides of 3 sheets, and it began not with pleasantries, but simply with, "I have been trying to write this letter since November and have failed 9 times. This is the 10th attempt." She read it standing on the porch of her father's store in the May sunshine, with his hand still holding hers, and she did not care in the slightest who was watching. The letter was, in the careful and straightforward way of everything he did, a declaration. It said that he had come to the mountains because he needed space and solitude and the particular quiet of high places, and that he had believed for 6 years that this was all he needed, and that he had been, it turned out, incorrect. It said that he had been writing to her for 7 months, and had in that time understood things about himself that the mountains had not managed to teach him, which he found both humbling and remarkable. It said that he did not know what she wanted for her life, or whether what she wanted had any room in it for a man who lived above 9,000 feet and could not promise her society or comfort or the kind of life that Dusty Creek might consider appropriate, but that if she wanted to find out, he would like very much to be the man she found it out with. Near the end it said, "I am aware that the first thing I ever said to you was not what one might call an ideal introduction. I would like, if possible, to do considerably better going forward." Miriam folded the letter and looked up at him. His expression was very still, the way faces go still when the person wearing them is feeling something strongly and has learned not to let it move their features. "Emmett," she said. "Yes?" "I have been in love with you since January," she said clearly, "and I would very much like you to do considerably better going forward." He let out a breath that contained something large in it, relief and warmth, and something that was perhaps the end of a very long kind of waiting. And then he put both hands on either side of her face, and she went up on her toes, and he kissed her there on the porch of her father's dry goods store in front of Dusty Creek, Colorado, in the early afternoon of the 4th day of May, 1875. Several people stopped what they were doing to watch this. Mrs. Sullivan, who was coming out of the bakery 2 doors down, said later that she had never seen anything quite so satisfying in her life. Abner Steele, from behind the window of the general store across the street, shook his head and smiled, which was more facial expression than he had demonstrated in years. Clara, who had somehow materialized on the other side of the street with her youngest child on her hip, looked at her husband Ben beside her and said very quietly, "I told you." Thomas Colby appeared in the doorway of his store and took in the scene, and the expression on his face was the complicated one of a father who has made a serious mistake and is watching something good happen in spite of it. And it was the closest thing to peace he had looked since before the wedding. That evening there was a supper at the Colby house that felt entirely different from the cautious meals of the previous September. There was wine, which Thomas Colby produced from the back of a cabinet with the air of a man reserving it for a specific occasion. Ruth Colby made 3 kinds of pie, which Clara correctly identified as her mother's most expansive expression of approval. Emmett sat at the table and was entirely himself in a way that Miriam found remarkable, not performing ease, but genuinely at ease, or if not quite that, then willing to be present in whatever the situation was. He talked with her father about the fur prices he had gotten in Denver on his way through, which led to a long conversation about commerce in the territory, and then talked with Clara about her children, and then talked with Ruth about pie, of all things, with genuine interest and attention. And by the end of the evening, Ruth Colby had the expression of a woman who has found something unexpected and entirely satisfactory. After supper, Miriam and Emmett walked again, this time up the river road in the spring dark, the creek running high and fast and cold with snowmelt beside them, the cottonwoods in fresh green leaf and loud with frogs. "What happens now?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked in September, but it felt different now, not frightened, but forward-facing. "I'd like to ask your father properly for his blessing," he said. "Tomorrow, if that's all right." "I think he'll say yes," she said. "I think he's been trying to say yes since September." "And you?" he asked. She stopped walking and turned to face him. He stopped too, and they were standing in the moonlight beside the creek, and she could hear the water and the frogs and somewhere far up the valley, something that might have been an owl. "I want to see the cabin," she said. He looked at her. "You want to come up the mountain?" "Eventually," she said. "Yes. I want to see where you live. I want to know what it looks like when the blizzard is outside and the fire is inside. I want to see the stars from 9,000 feet. She paused. "I want all of it, Emmett. All of the things in that letter and the things you didn't put in the letter. I want the life, not just the idea of it." He was very still for a moment. Then he put his arms around her, properly, and she felt the enormous solidity of him and put her face against the front of his buckskin shirt and breathed in the smell of pine and wood smoke and mountain air that had been living in her imagination for months. "All right," he said into her hair. "All right. Yes." He stayed in Dusty Creek for 3 weeks, which was considerably longer than any supply run required. He asked Thomas Colby for his blessing on the second morning, a conversation which Clara later reported had made their father cry, though Thomas himself firmly denied this. He helped Ben Fletcher rebuild a fence section that had gone in the spring floods, which earned him the admiration of every man who watched him work, and installed 2 new shelves in the dry goods store, which were, according to Thomas Colby, significantly better constructed than the existing ones. He attended Sunday services at the church where he had first appeared, which caused a certain amount of pointed interest from the congregation that he absorbed with equanimity, and shook Reverend Calloway's hand afterward. And Reverend Calloway told him he was glad things had worked out the way they had, which was perhaps slightly unorthodox for a man of God, but felt entirely appropriate. He and Miriam talked at length and unhurriedly about the practical architecture of a shared life. He was honest about the mountains, the isolation, the harshness of the winters, the distance from everything that constituted regular society. She was honest about herself, that she had never roughed it had never been higher than the pass road, had no experience of the kind of life he was describing. They talked about what she would need, and what he could provide, and what they would build together, and these conversations were among the most real and grounding that Miriam had ever had, because they were between two people who were treating each other as full participants rather than decorations. He was also, in the evenings, in the ways that did not require conversation more than she had imagined, which was already considerable. He was patient in a way that was not passive, active, thoughtful patience, the kind that moves toward rather than simply waiting. He was attentive without being suffocating. He laughed at things she said, the genuine, surprised laugh of a man being truly delighted, which was something she had not experienced enough of. When she was upset about something, her mother's occasional lapses into anxiety about the unconventionality of the whole arrangement, or the lingering social turbulence of Dusty Creek's opinion, he listened without offering solutions until she asked for them, and when she asked, they were good ones. He touched her hair a great deal. She was not sure he was entirely aware of it. They were married on the second Saturday of June, 1875, in the same church where everything had begun, by the same Reverend Calloway who had been present for the beginning and seemed genuinely delighted to provide the ending. Miriam wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico because she had decided she was finished with ivory, and it fit her exactly as she was, which was exactly as she wanted it. Her hair was pinned with wildflowers from the meadow above town. She did not carry a bouquet, because the last time she had carried a bouquet, she had set it down deliberately, and she preferred the symbolism of empty, open hands. Emmett stood at the altar in a clean shirt and his best trousers, and had clearly made an extraordinary effort with his hair, which had been persuaded into something approaching order by what must have been a significant application of determination. He was, in Miriam's assessment, the most remarkable-looking man she had ever seen, which she recognized as partial and correct. When she walked up the aisle on her father's arm, Emmett watched her in a way that made the entire congregation feel slightly like they were intruding on something private. The ceremony was brief and clear and fully uninterrupted by large men appearing in doorways, which everyone appreciated. When Reverend Calloway pronounced them husband and wife, and Emmett kissed her, Clara made a small, involuntary sound of satisfaction that caused Ben to squeeze her hand. The reception was held outside, in the meadow behind the church, with tables borrowed from the town hall, and food provided by approximately 40 women who had decided that this warranted the full effort of the community's collective kitchen, and whiskey provided by Sullivan, who said it was on him and seemed to mean it. There was a fiddle player and someone with a harmonica, and dancing in the early summer evening while the mountains turned pink and then purple and then deep blue against the sky. And Emmett danced with her in the way of a man who did not know precisely how to dance but was entirely willing to try. And she laughed, and he laughed, and it was, she thought, the best evening of her life. Her father was the last person to go, and before he left he embraced her for a long time, and said into her hair that he was more sorry than he could say, and she said that she knew, and that she loved him, and he nodded and shook Emmett's hand, and walked back toward town in the summer dark. They left for the mountains 2 days later, in the early morning, with 3 horses loaded with everything Miriam needed for a first season at altitude. Emmett went through the list with her several times to make sure everything was accounted for: warm clothing, tools, books, the small framed drawing of Clara and the children that she was not leaving behind under any circumstances. The ride up was a full day and a half, climbing steadily north through stands of aspen and then pine, and then the spare, wind-shaped timber of the upper elevations. Miriam had been on horseback all her life, but not on mountain trails, and the first hours were a negotiation between her and the horse and the terrain, which Emmett managed with quiet helpfulness, riding ahead on the difficult sections and giving directions back, or dropping back to ride beside her on the wider stretches. At the midpoint, he showed her a viewpoint, a flat ledge of rock that jutted out from the ridge and gave a view across a sweep of mountains that went on for what looked like the entire width of the world, peaks upon peaks in every direction, and the valley they had come from was a small green crease far below, and Dusty Creek was invisible from this height. She stood on the edge of the rock and looked at it. He stood beside her. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's rather large," she said. "It is. How have you been up here alone for 6 years?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the ranges. "I didn't know it was insufficient," he said, "until I did." She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they stood there for a while on the edge of the ridgeline with the whole world visible below them, before turning and going up. The cabin was everything he had described in his letters, and also completely unlike the mental image she had constructed from those descriptions, which she suspected was true of every real place that has been thoroughly written about. It was smaller than she had imagined, and also somehow more substantial. The logs heavy and tight-fitted, the roof steeply pitched for snow load, the window on the south wall letting in a bar of mountain light that fell across a floor of smooth-worn boards. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and leather and books, and the fireplace in the north wall was built with a competence that was clearly the work of a man who trusted his life to it every winter. He had cleaned it before going down. She could see the evidence of that effort and found it touching in a way she did not quite say. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned in a slow circle. "It's wonderful," she said. He was standing in the doorway with his arms folded, watching her. "You don't have to say that." "I know I don't have to," she said. "It's wonderful. It's small and it's in the middle of nowhere and it smells like a forest. And it is wonderful." He smiled, and it was that full smile again, the one that changed the whole landscape of his face. She began to make it hers. Not by changing it. She understood instinctively that these walls were the physical form of 6 years of his particular solitude, and that replacing them would be wrong, but by adding herself to them. The framed drawing of Clara and the children went on the shelf beside his 3 books. The small braided rug she had brought from her room in Dusty Creek went in front of the fireplace. She rearranged the kitchen supplies in a way that made the space work better, and he watched her do it and said nothing except, "Yes, that's better," which was, she felt, the correct response. That first summer in the high mountains was the steepest and most complete education of Miriam's life. She learned to identify weather by the behavior of the birds and the particular quality of the afternoon light. She learned how to bank a fire for the night so it would catch in the morning. She learned the specific labor of a life at altitude, the wood to be cut, the water to be carried, the food to be preserved, the 1,000 small necessary things that filled every day. It was harder than anything she had ever done, and also more satisfying, in the particular way of hard things done well in beautiful places. Emmett was a patient and thorough teacher. He showed her things directly, without condescension or impatience, and when she made mistakes, and there were mistakes, some of them significant, including one incident with a rabbit snare that she preferred not to dwell on, he corrected them without commentary beyond what was necessary. He treated her competence as something that existed and needed instruction rather than something that needed to be established from scratch, which was a quality she had not appreciated, having never experienced it before. In the evenings they sat by the fire and read or talked, and sometimes simply sat, in the comfortable silence that she had first encountered in September on the river road, and had, over the intervening months, come to understand was one of his greatest gifts, the ability to be fully present in quiet, without needing to fill it. She told him things she had never told anyone, not sequentially or deliberately, but in the way that things come out when there is time and privacy and someone who listens, about the year before the wedding, the slow erosion of her sense of herself, the way she had begun to distrust her own perceptions of what she was worth. He listened with his whole attention and said, at the end of a particularly long evening's telling, that he thought she was the most substantial person he had ever met, and that he used that word deliberately and without apology. She laughed, which was what he intended. "You are the only man in the world," she said, "who could make that word a compliment." "I've been trying for a year," he said with great dignity. That autumn they came down to Dusty Creek for the winter, because Miriam was 3 months along and Emmett was not going to deliver a baby in the mountains alone in his first year of marriage. Miriam agreed with this decision, though she noted that she was perfectly capable of having opinions about it, to which he replied that he was fully aware of that, which was why he was explaining his reasoning rather than simply acting on it. This small exchange, which took perhaps 30 seconds, contained within it the entire grammar of how they operated together, and Miriam recognized it and thought, yes, This is what it is supposed to be. They arrived in Dusty Creek in October to considerable celebration. Ruth Colby burst into tears at the sight of her daughter, which she did at every significant event and several insignificant ones. Thomas Colby shook Emmett's hand with both of his and looked, Miriam thought, like a man who was still in the process of forgiving himself and finding it somewhat easier each time. Clara came over within the hour and sat with Miriam in the kitchen and demanded a full account of everything, which Miriam provided over the course of 2 pots of coffee, and Clara listened with the expression of someone receiving exactly what they had hoped for and finding it better than expected. The winter in Dusty Creek was warm and domestic and punctuated by the particular mild chaos of an expanding family. Miriam's pregnancy had her tired in the early months, and then, by winter, energetically impatient, which expressed itself in a project to reorganize and repaint every room in her parents' house, which her mother accepted with the flexibility of a woman who had learned which battles not to fight. Emmett was attentive in winter in the way he was attentive in everything, seriously and practically, and without making her feel fragile, which was what she needed. He went with her to the doctor in Dusty Creek, a young man named Elias Pratt, who had come from Ohio the previous year and was still slightly startled by the altitude, and listened carefully to everything Dr. Pratt said and asked good questions. He also, in January, taught himself to bake bread. Not well, initially. Clara tasted the first loaf and described it diplomatically as very dense, but with the steady application to skill improvement that characterized everything he did. By February, the bread was acceptable. By March, it was good. Miriam thought this was, in miniature, the perfect description of him. The baby came on a Tuesday in the middle of April, 1876. A boy, large and emphatic about his opinions from the first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's dark eyes and a set of lungs that Clara said could be heard from the street. They named him Thomas Emmett Hale. Thomas for the grandfather who sat by the bed looking stunned with gratitude, Emmett for the father who held him in his enormous hands with the particular careful stillness of someone who has just encountered something irreplaceable. Miriam watched Emmett hold their son for the first time and felt something she had no language for, a feeling that was beyond happiness, that was about fullness, about the sense that she had arrived somewhere real. Thomas Emmett Hale, Emmett said quietly, addressing the baby directly, as though establishing a clear and respectful relationship from the outset. "You're going to need better manners than your entrance suggested," Miriam laughed. It was her real laugh, the one that sounded like falling downstairs, and it filled the room. They went back up the mountain in June, taking young Thomas with them, who appeared unbothered by altitude and deeply fascinated by everything. The summer was one of the best of Miriam's life, not because it was easy, because it was not, because caring for an infant at 9,000 feet is exactly as demanding as it sounds, but because it was hers. Every complicated, exhausting, beautiful day of it was hers, built from choices she had made with clear eyes and a full heart. She drew constantly that summer. She filled 2 notebooks with drawings of the mountains and the cabin, and Emmett working, and the baby sleeping, and the elk that came to the meadow in the evenings. The drawings were good, genuinely good, in the way that things become good when they are given the space to develop, and Emmett had framed 3 of them and hung them on the cabin walls with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who recognized quality without needing to discuss it. "You should send some of these to the papers," he told her one evening in July, looking at a drawing of the ridgeline she had done in ink. The illustrated papers in Denver would pay for mountain views like this. She looked at the drawing. "Do you think so?" "I know so," he said. "I've seen what they print. Yours are better." In September, she sent 3 drawings to the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. In November, she received a letter offering to pay her for them and requesting more. This was, she thought, perhaps the final piece of something that had been assembling itself since the moment she had set down a wedding bouquet on an altar and walked out of a church on the arm of a stranger. The following years laid themselves out with the particular richness of lives that are genuinely lived in. Emmett took on a partner in his trapping work in the winter of 1877, a Ute man named Davis, who knew the mountain ranges north of the cabin better than anyone alive and with whom Emmett had a long and respectful working relationship that Miriam was glad of. not least because it meant she was not the only one who occasionally had to explain things to Emmett about the world beyond the tree line. Davis had a wife named Sarah who came from Tennessee and who had, in Miriam's estimation, possibly the sharpest mind she had ever encountered, and the four of them developed the kind of friendship that is built on real regard rather than proximity. Miriam's drawings for the Rocky Mountain News became a regular feature, and by 1878 she was receiving enough from them to consider it a genuine income, which gave her a satisfaction she was fairly certain was related to something beyond money. Thomas grew into a boy who was large like his father and curious like his mother, and had, by age 3, already demonstrated the will to climb every fixed structure within his radius of motion. In the spring of 1878, Miriam discovered she was expecting again, and this time she was less frightened by it, more straightforwardly glad. They went down to Dusty Creek in October as they had before, and in the middle of December, during a snowstorm that sealed the windows in white and filled the town with a particular soft quiet, their second child was born. A girl this time, small and fierce and dark-eyed, who they named Ruth Clara Hale, for the grandmother who cried again and the aunt who had been right about everything from the beginning. Dusty Creek had changed somewhat by 1878, as all places change. The railway was coming closer, which meant that people who had never heard of the town would hear of it within a few years, and the character of the streets was slowly changing from frontier to something more deliberately settled. Gerald Hoffstead had married a woman from Denver 2 years after the incident at the church and lived at the family ranch and was occasionally seen in town, and Miriam, when she encountered him, treated him with the clear-eyed courtesy of someone who has fully understood the past and has no remaining use for it. Dorothea Hoffstead was, reportedly, still difficult about everything. Miriam found that this troubled her approximately as much as the opinions of the Wolverine Emmett had once written to her about. The dry goods store prospered, as Thomas Colby's debts were gradually resolved and his reputation as a reliable and honest man, which it had always been underneath the terrible decision, was restored to its natural place. Ruth Colby discovered that she found Emmett Hale enormously reassuring in the way of a woman who has spent her life slightly anxious about things too large to be managed and had found, in her son-in-law, someone who seemed constitutionally unable to be defeated by weather, circumstance, or difficult people. She fed him enormous quantities of food every time he came down from the mountain, which he accepted with the sincerity of a man who had genuinely missed good cooking during the trapping season. They built a second room onto the cabin in the summer of 1879, because 2 children and an adult-sized man in one room and a sleeping loft was working fine, but better could be arranged, and Emmett and Davis built it together over 3 weeks with timber cut from the ridge above, and Miriam served as the unofficial foreman of the operation, which she felt was the natural consequence of being the one who understood how the space needed to function. That autumn, with the new room completed and the cabin smelling of fresh wood and the mountains turning gold around them, Miriam sat on the step of the cabin in the late September afternoon, with Ruth Clara asleep in her lap, and Thomas playing in the yard with an elaborate system of sticks that appeared to be a fort, and watched Emmett come across the meadow from the woodpile with an armload of timber. He was wearing his old buckskin shirt, the original one from when she had first seen him, now patched on one elbow. His hair was past his shoulders again. She kept meaning to cut it and kept finding it beautiful and losing interest in the project. His arms were loaded with firewood, and he was walking with the unhurried particular purpose that he brought to everything. And he saw her on the step, and his face changed in the way it always did, that quiet, full, wholly unguarded change that she had spent 4 years watching and never gotten tired of. He dropped the wood at the side of the house and came to sit beside her on the step. Thomas immediately abandoned the fort to climb on him, which Emmett permitted with the weary good humor of a man who has accepted that he is a climbing structure as part of the terms of fatherhood. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, getting Thomas settled on his knee. She looked at the mountains. They were enormous and clear in the September light, and the aspen on the lower slopes had gone entirely gold, and she thought about a girl in an ivory dress standing at an altar with her hands very still, and about a shadow in a doorway, and about what courage looked like when it came from the most unlikely direction. "I was thinking," she said, About how things begin. He looked at her sideways. Things like what? Things like this, she said, gesturing at everything. The cabin and the children and the mountains and the two of them on the step together in the autumn light. In a church doorway, he said with a self-awareness she found charming. On a church doorway step, she corrected, slightly before. I was going to handle that better, he said. You have told me this many times, she said. I remain perfectly satisfied with how you handled it. He was quiet for a moment, watching the mountains, and Thomas had fallen into a half-doze on his knee with the efficiency of a child who has decided the next event in his day is sleep. Ruth Clara breathed in and out in Miriam's arms, small and warm and thoroughly present. I've been thinking, he said carefully, which was always how he began things that mattered. About what? About coming down more, he said. Not permanently, but there are things the children will need. School eventually. People. I've been thinking about whether there's a way to have both, the mountain and the town. She looked at him. This was, she knew, a considerable thing for him to say. Not a sacrifice, exactly, because he loved his children with the same absolute completeness he brought to everything he loved, but a negotiation between the self he had built in solitude and the self he was becoming in company. I've been thinking the same thing, she said. You have? Clara's children are growing up with Thomas as a cousin who lives half the year above the tree line, she said. I want them to know each other better than twice a year allows. He nodded slowly. We could winter in Dusty Creek, he said, every year, and come up in the spring when the pass opens. Davis manages fine in the winter alone. He prefers it. And in the summers, she said, we'd be here. Yes? With the mountains, she said. With the mountains, he agreed. Ruth Clara stirred and made a small, indeterminate sound, and Miriam looked down at her daughter's face, which was perfect and entirely itself in the way of very small people who have not yet had the chance to become anything other than what they are. Emmett, she said. Yes. You know I would have married Gerald Hoffstead, she said, if you hadn't walked through that door. I know, he said. I would have married him and learned to be smaller and quieter, and I would have called it a life. She paused. It would have been a life, a whole life, just not this one, he said. Not this one, she agreed. He put his arm around her, carefully, so as not to disturb the sleeping baby, and she leaned into the side of him and felt the warmth and solidity that she had first felt on a church porch in September, and that had never, in 4 years, given her any reason to doubt it. The mountains were going to gold and blue above them. The creek was running somewhere below them, clear and cold and constant. Thomas breathed in and out on his father's knee with the deep, trustful sleep of children who know without knowing it that they are held by something steady. They stayed on the step until the light went and the stars came out, and the stars at 9,000 feet were, as he had told her in a letter on a January night a long time ago, cut rather than merely seen. Dusty Creek, in the winter of 1879, welcomed them back as it always did, with the particular warmth of a small town that has watched something good develop and considers itself, not entirely incorrectly, somewhat responsible for it. Reverend Calloway always shook Emmett's hand after Sunday services with the expression of a man who knows he was present for something that will be told as a story for decades. Sullivan's Bar had an unofficial tradition of buying Emmett Hale his first drink of every season, on the grounds that a man who had the nerve to walk into a church and interrupt a wedding had earned standing credit at any bar he chose to enter. Thomas Emmett Hale, age 3 and already considerably larger than most children his age, began attending the small schoolhouse in Dusty Creek that winter, where the teacher, a determined woman named Miss Alderton, reported that he had excellent focus, a good memory, and strong opinions about everything, which she said in a tone that suggested she respected the opinions while remaining professionally cautious about the strength. Ruth Clara, at 1 year old, began walking with the same forward, purposeful momentum that characterized both her parents, and seemed genuinely annoyed by any horizontal surface that was not directly in her path. She had her mother's eyes and her father's will to occupy space, and Clara said she was going to be magnificent, which Miriam thought was entirely likely. Clara's own family had grown by then. 3 children now, the third a boy born in the summer, and Clara and Ben had expanded their house on the east side of town to accommodate them. The two families spent the winters in easy proximity, the children growing up together in the overlapping way of cousins who were also friends, and the adults maintaining the particular close companionship of people who have been through something together and come out on the other side, still choosing each other's company. Thomas Colby had finally paid off the last of his debt to the Hoffstead family by the end of 1879, a fact he announced at Christmas dinner with the shaking, relieved voice of a man setting down something he's been carrying for a very long time. Everyone at the table cheered, including Emmett, who then poured everyone another measure of whiskey, including, controversially, young Thomas, who got approximately a teaspoon in a very large glass of water and felt enormously important about it. Ruth Colby cried. This surprised no one. That night, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, Miriam sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and her drawing materials and worked on a piece she had been building for several weeks, a large drawing of the cabin in winter, seen from the meadow below, with the mountains behind it and smoke coming from the chimney and the window lit from within, suggesting warmth against the snow. She had been contracted to provide 6 large illustrations for a Denver publisher who was putting together a book about life in the Colorado Rockies, and this was to be the centerpiece. Emmett came down from checking on the children and sat across from her, pulling over a book he had been reading, one of the new ones Clara had given him for Christmas, a natural history of the Rocky Mountain territories that he had already read 40 pages of. He read. She drew. The fire crackled and the house was warm, and outside the December dark was full of snow. After a while he looked up and watched her work. She was aware of his attention and did not look up because she was at a precise part of a line, and looking up would interrupt it. "That's the best one yet," he said. "You say that about all of them," she said, without looking up. "I keep being right," he said. She smiled at the drawing. "Miriam," he said in the quiet, particular way. Now she looked up. He was looking at her across the table in the lamplight, and his expression had that quality it sometimes had in the evenings, openly warm in the way he would never have been in public, entirely unguarded, the look of a man who has found his place and knows it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Walking into that church was the bravest thing I have ever done," he said, "and also the most fortunate." She looked at him steadily. "You told me that before." "I know," he said. "I keep finding it true." She set down her pencil. "Emmett Hale," she said. "Yes." "Come here," she said. He came around the table and she stood up, and he put his arms around her in the way that had been, from the very first time, the most purely comfortable place she had ever been, the enormous, certain, gentle sureness of him. She put her face against the front of his shirt and felt his heartbeat, steady and consistent, the way things in the mountains were steady and consistent when they were built to last. Outside, the snow was falling on Dusty Creek, settling soft and deep on the street and the rooftops and the church where everything had begun. And somewhere up above the town, above the dark shapes of the ranges, the cabin was standing in its meadow with snow on the roof, waiting for the spring. And in the spring, they would go back up, as they always did, following the pass road north into the clean, cold air, with the children and the horses and the drawings and the books and everything they had made of a life that had almost been settled for something smaller. In the spring they would go up, but tonight, in the warm kitchen, with the lamp and the fire and the sound of their children breathing somewhere above them, this was enough. This was, in fact, considerably more than enough. This was the thing that was left when you cleared away everything that had been asked of you and given back nothing, and this was the thing that had been worth every difficult step of the getting to it. The snow fell, and the fire burned, and the mountains waited, as they always did, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small, warm dramas of the people who lived in their shadow, and yet somehow containing them all the love and courage and second chances, all the doors walked through and decisions made, and bouquets set down deliberately on altars, all the letters and long evenings and mountains seen from ledges at the edge of the sky, containing them the way mountains contain everything that happens on their slopes, without judgment, without memory, without end.